What happens when social anxiety becomes the quiet law of a world, shaping homes, habits, and law, and every step outside? Take a comfortable sit, dim the lights down, and get ready to drift into the galactic twilight. In a world of perfect silence where 10,000 hands served each solitary figure, life endured as ritual. Solaria was not crowded. It was filled with absence. Wealth echoed louder than voices which rarely met. In the 4700s of the galactic era, when Earth strained under domed cities and Aurora declared itself the foremost spacer colony, Solaria emerged as an anomaly. It was a green and balanced world, its skies untroubled, its lands divided into vast estates. Human presence, however, was scarce by deliberate choice. The Solarians had decreed a population limit, never to exceed 20,000 adults, each attended by an army of robots. This numerical symmetry, nearly 10,000 mechanicals, for each living soul, defined not only labor but identity itself. Solaria's environment was Earth-like but gentler, shaped by design rather than struggle. Native ecology had been carefully pruned and engineered. The grasslands spread in measured hues of green, orchards arranged with mathematical regularity, rivers redirected to ensure permanence of comfort, clouds gathered only when scheduled, for climate was a matter of control, not of chance. The sun that gave Solaria its name shone upon landscapes sculpted to soothe the eye and deny the possibility of disorder. The estate was the fundamental unit of Solarian existence. Each human lived at the heart of domains that stretched for kilometers in every direction. Within these lands, robots maintained crops, tended machines, adjusted atmospheric regulators, and ensured that no burden touched their master's hands. Communication between humans relied on viewing, projection across distance. To be physically present with another was considered invasive, even dangerous. This distance was not a failing, but a principle built into the education of children and the protocols of governance. To outsiders, Solaria appeared paradoxical, a planet that had achieved abundance, order, and leisure, yet drained of contact, emptied of the very friction that defined societies. It was a spacer triumph and already perhaps a foreshadowed fragility. In the 4700s of the galactic era, long after Earth had enclosed its millions under steel caverns, the spacer worlds stretched outward with promise. Aurora, the first and proudest colony, had declared itself the guiding elder of the settlement wave. Solaria came later, founded by those who carried not only the technologies of the spacers, but also a sharper distaste for the crowding and conflict that had marked Earth's descent into urban density. The planet was chosen precisely because of its distance, set far enough from Earth to resist interference, yet within the network of spacer reach. At the time of its colonization, Solaria was an ordinary habitable sphere, its atmosphere already near Earth's ratio of oxygen and nitrogen, its climate temperate, its surface divided between plains, forests, and rolling seas. But the settlers had no intention of merely inheriting what they found. They began immediately with transformations. Forests stood in perfect squares, trimmed like gardens. Rivers did not wander. They were straightened or widened until they obeyed. Indigenous species that threatened agricultural uniformity were erased, and imported flora were arranged into orchards of endless symmetry. planet was not allowed to remain what it had been discovered as. It became a design, cultivated into harmony that reflected the minds of its owners. The settlers' motives were not expansion in the usual sense. They were not driven by hunger for trade routes or territorial control. Rather, Solaria was conceived as an experiment in human separation. Where Aurora tolerated gatherings in its measured cities, Solaria would disperse its people across vast lands, each family, then each individual, set apart from others by kilometers of distance. Population growth was not simply limited but deliberately capped. Laws forbade the existence of more than 20,000 adults. Every birth was licensed, every union regulated, and any deviation was curtailed. The Solarians designed themselves into scarcity, equating solitude with stability. This design found its mechanical complement in robots. From the beginning, Solaria mandated the highest ratio of automation in the spacer worlds, where Aurora relied on thousands of machines to maintain cities and estates. Solaria multiplied the number tenfold. A Solarian child grew up attended by more caretakers than one could ever remember by name. The rule became established: 10,000 robots per human. Their tasks were not merely agricultural or industrial, but penetrated every routine of life. They prepared food, maintained environmental balance, polished surfaces, repaired each other, and reported in silent hierarchies. Human hands rarely lifted more than a gesture of instruction. Governance on Solaria did not resemble councils or assemblies. The judicial complex, technically the planetary capital, stood in architectural solitude. Its purpose was less to gather leaders than to regulate procedures. The granting of reproductive licenses, the allocation of resources, the adjudication of disputes, usually carried out through projection. In a society that mistrusted presence, government itself became dispersed. Decisions were transmitted, never convened. The very idea of a parliament was alien. Solaria existed as an archipelago of estates, each orbiting its master, each sustained by machines, tied together only by law and distance. In the early centuries, this system flourished. Solarians enjoyed lifespans exceeding 2 centuries, unburdened by labor, their bodies preserved through spacer medicine, their estates overflowing with food and beauty. Disease was nearly absent, climate was mastered, and every personal desire was answered by a mechanical service. Outsiders, when rarely allowed to observe, noted the perfection of order and the astonishing silence of human absence. There were no crowds, no cities, no marketplaces, only the rustle of automated labor and the occasional voice projected across invisible channels. Yet from the beginning, there were signs of brittleness. Children raised with aversion to presence found even the rare necessity of contact intolerable. Courtships became abstractions, carried out through holographic appearances, regulated by genetic councils rather than personal bonds. Visitors from Earth or Aurora experienced the disquiet of vast estates whose owners hesitated to meet in person. Solarians themselves reinforced this as virtue, labeling the taboo the presence, something to be avoided as one avoids contagion. What began as preference hardened into doctrine. The economy of Solaria mirrored this isolation. Unlike Aurora, which participated in trade, Solaria chose near-total autarky. It exported little and imported less, relying on the efficiency of its robots to produce all it required. Energy was drawn from solar collectors and planetary fusion nodes. Food was harvested from automated farms. Technology was maintained by machines programmed to renew their own parts. Human creativity, once central to colonization, was gradually surrendered to systemic automation. This gave the illusion of permanence, as though Solaria could continue unchanged indefinitely. Nevertheless, small disturbances surfaced. Records describe disputes where robots faltered when privacy directives clashed with the 3 laws of robotics. Some estates became arenas of quiet breakdown, where a solitary human, unused to contact, demanded perfection from machines that could not reconcile contradictory orders. Though usually corrected, such incidents revealed the fragility beneath the abundance. Culturally, Solaria developed traits distinct from other spacer worlds. Art was produced in isolation, meant for projection rather than shared experience. Research focused obsessively on robotics and genetics, disciplines that could be advanced without collaboration. Solarian science leaned toward refinement rather than exploration, aiming to perfect inheritance and control rather than seek novelty. The idea of exploration beyond their planet lost urgency. Their colony had become an end in itself, a closed loop of perfected solitude. Through the centuries, Solaria's population remained steady, each new adult replacing one who had died. Estates passed from generation to generation, not as crowded inheritances, but as vast legacies for single heirs. Robots maintained continuity, recording every preference, ensuring that when heirs assumed control, they stepped into patterns already established. The continuity of estates gave the impression that human lives were mere moments within the longer permanence of automated service. By the time Earth detective Elijah Bailey set foot on Solaria during his investigation into a spacer's death, the planet's peculiar balance was already centuries old. To him, the silence was unsettling, the aversion to presence inexplicable. Yet for Solarians, this was the only natural order. They believed themselves insulated from the decay afflicting Earth, from the reliance of Aurorans on councils and compromise. In their eyes, Solaria represented the culmination of spacer ideals: eternal leisure, eternal solitude, eternal control. But history would later prove otherwise. As the spacer worlds entered decline, Solaria's extreme isolation did not preserve it, but instead prepared the way for disappearance. By the time of robots and empire, Solaria would be found abandoned, its robots continuing in emptiness, its human population banished. What had begun as experiment and controlled solitude had set the trajectory toward extinction. The history of Solaria, then, is not only the account of a colony's founding. It is the record of an idea carried to its logical end. To avoid the press of crowds, they removed community. To avoid labor, they surrendered action. To avoid disorder, they surrendered growth. The result was a planet of great beauty, profound order, and ultimate fragility. In the Spacer era, circa 3421 CE, long before the Galactic Era calendar and millennia prior to the Foundation, Solaria stood at its carefully maintained peak. Its people lived dispersed upon engineered land, each attended by numbers that exceeded imagination. The approach to an estate began long before any dwelling appeared. From the air, orchards arranged themselves into regular lattices, square upon square of citrus and stone fruit. with narrow silver service paths cutting between the green. Forests held their lines as though laid by compass, their edges straight, their undergrowth trimmed to a groomed hush. Plains shone with soft gold, grains standing at uniform height, their ripeness predicted by quiet models that had never erred. There were no walls. Distance itself did the work of separation. The only movement on most days came from small, purposeful machines and the patient drift of clouds that had been scheduled to drift. Silence remained the prevailing sound. It settled over the land like an accepted rule. Machines made noise, yet even these noises were measured. A low electric purr from irrigation crawlers, the faint click of sensor vanes rotating in the wind, the whisper of a drone descending toward a fault marker pinned to some distant corner of a field. The air smelled clean and faintly vegetal. A human might step outside for minutes at a time, allowing filtered sunlight to touch the skin, then return within to let service continue unobserved. The estate did not request labor. It accepted preferences. Robots patterned the terrain as if it were a ledger. Soil chemistry stayed within narrow bands. Moisture rose and fell to plan. The weather lattice, a network of orbital collectors and atmosphere stations, maintained the mildness Solaria had promised itself. Rain arrived on the calendar, fog on the schedule, sunlight at calibrated intensities. Storms existed, but they existed as options to be deferred. Comfort was not left to chance, it was administered. She woke as the blinds parted, just as she had set them years ago. The air was cool. From far away drifted the faint scent of lemon leaves. The service unit had already verified her salt intake and prepared tea at the temperature she tolerated in early autumn. She walked the corridor in slippers that hugged the floor without sound, and a wall shifted to reveal the morning room. The tray arrived precisely, borne by two quiet frames that waited one pace behind her chair. She ate slowly, reading the overnight yield figures projected into the air. Outside, irrigation crawlers were tracking a nutrient dip along row 19. A small fault icon pulsed in the corner of her display. She acknowledged it, and the icon dimmed. When she finished, the tea had cooled by 3 degrees more than she preferred. An air ionizer on the far wall had slipped out of alignment, changing the taste by a margin she noticed. A maintenance unit corrected it within minutes. She reset the tea specification, then closed the projection and sat with her hands folded, already forgetting the correction as part of the ongoing order. Between the orchard belts and the plains stood the subtle infrastructure of governance that did not look like governance at all. An estate ruled itself through protocols, not through staff. Directives passed from a single human's console to concentric circles of robotic hierarchy, each circle interpreting under safety constraints that were older than the houses they served. The 3 laws were present here, but on Solaria they were buried beneath thousands of customary instructions about privacy, distance, and obedience to habit. Where other worlds put their authority into public chambers, Solaria embedded it into soil sensors and kitchen dispensers. The result felt less like rule and more like inertia. The land read as a record of decisions. Tree spacing reflected one owner's tolerance for shadow. The angle of drainage channels told the story of a decade that had favored certain grains. Rocks that would have marked a boundary elsewhere were lifted and set as sculpture along a path that no one walked. There were benches near water that had accepted no weight for years. The estate spoke of human taste, but the voice one heard most clearly belonged to maintenance. Machine roots braided the ground in intricate loops. Service drones flew low in long rectangles over meadow grass, mapping pests that had not appeared in a generation. Farther west, pruning units read leaf edges, compared them to an archive of leaf edges, and made adjustments smaller than sight. To approach this terrain was to approach a certainty that nothing here would surprise its master. Even the wind was trimmed, slowed along hedgerows planted to reduce turbulence. The remaining breeze carried a brief scent of citrus, then spent itself on carefully placed screens. At the very margins, the weather lattice revealed itself. Tall, spare towers rose at long intervals, their surfaces plain and pale, the only verticals daring to interrupt the horizon. They did not blink or flare. They only waited, receiving and transmitting corrections that the estate would never feel. Above them, orbital mirrors angled light along prescribed paths, a choreography arranged months earlier by algorithms trained on preference. Rain, when it came, arrived in lines, never in sheets. It fell with a calm consistency that hoses later echoed as they traced the absences between rows. Unit 7L had verified the moisture plan at dawn. The estate's owner had requested clear skies until midday to review a sculpture alignment on the south terrace. The crops, according to yesterday's model, could accept the delay. At 10, a new reading rose from the root monitors along the wheat margin. The outermost quadrant had dried faster than expected. 7L flagged the conflict. Maintain clear skies as ordered, or adjust the schedule to meet plant health targets with local micro-irrigation. It chose the second. It routed 3 irrigation crawlers to the quadrant, then rebalanced the midday allotment over the remaining fields, preserving the aesthetic window without altering total volume. Above, the lattice held the clouds in place. Below, the crawlers traced thin lines through gold. When the owner stepped onto the terrace, the air was bright as requested. The leaves along the southern rows cooled by a fraction, unobserved. 7L filed the deviation and appended an explanation. No reply arrived, which counted as approval. The day moved forward, unchanged in all the ways that were required. Such decisions occurred incessantly, recorded but rarely reviewed. The estate was a book that updated itself, kept in order by minds that did not experience fatigue. This granted the human a peculiar freedom to be present without responsibility for presence. One might attend a research session from a lounge, authorize grafts in an orchard by gesture, or set the month's nutrition down to the mineral. One might alter nothing and still claim authorship. The robot's patience made every human preference durable. The human body responded to this arrangement by quieting. People walked less, not through decree, but because distance replaced paths and machines delivered everything that paths once provided. Shoulders lowered, hands forgot tools. Voices seldom strained to be heard. The skin recalled filtered air and a controlled warmth that never forced choice between shade and sun. When present outdoors, a Solarian wore comfort lightly and briefly, as though the weather were a museum whose gallery one visited for a measured interval. The land's aesthetics followed the same logic. Lines ran straight because straight lines simplified maintenance. Curves appeared where water required them, or where a human had once asked for an effect, and then never rescinded the request. The rare asymmetry existed as a relic of an experiment, a grove planted in a spiral to test a robot's pruning protocol, left in place when the result proved acceptable. From a distance, the sum read as serenity. From within, it read as reliable service. On most days, the estate carried the feeling of a long exhalation. The principal dwelling sat low, white or silver, its facades clean, its windows tuned to screen wavelengths that interfered with comfort. Inside, rooms answered to quiet names: study, East Hall, viewing chamber, each calibrated for one. Deep in the structure, maintenance corridors allowed fleets of small units to pass without appearing. The house was porous to service and resistant to intrusion. Every threshold recognized its owner and resisted everything else as a category, not an individual. From the standpoint of planetary history, such places recorded a choice. Solaria had resolved the old conflict between landscape and settlement by turning settlement into preference and landscape into procedure. There were no crowds to test the strength of bridges, no markets to force compromises of taste, no public parks to introduce chance. There were only estates, each a self-sufficient domain joined to the others by law and circuitry. The judicial complex far away symbolized a capital, yet the estate remained the real seat of rule, the small and absolute jurisdiction of one. Occasionally, deviations entered the record. A pruning unit cut a fraction too deep along a pear branch, and the branch had to be replaced. A soil sensor failed and was replaced before its absence affected the model. A maintenance drone dropped a panel screw, and a smaller drone retrieved it, logging the retrieval and the time. These events did not accumulate into disorder. They dissolved into process. The land continued, measured and maintained. The climate itself felt older than it was because it did not surprise. Spring advanced on the calendar rather than the wind's decision. Summer held at an amplitude the lattice could sustain without stress. Autumn lengthened or shortened to accommodate harvest logistics. Winter rounded its edges, snow appearing in thin, seasonal gestures that pleased certain eyes from behind glass. The planet had edited itself into a continuous clarity. The sky showed this most plainly. It carried no smudges of industry, only the soft geometry of what had been permitted. At the close of day, the estate dimmed in steps. Lights answered to circadian patterns agreed upon years ago. Far fields entered low-power routines. Forest paths absorbed their markers, returning to a uniform shade that slowed nocturnal maintenance. In houses, projection walls withdrew to flatness. There was music sometimes, generated for the owner by programs that learned preferences more precisely than memory. The music was not loud. It did not need to fill space, that distance already managed. Here the Solarian promise revealed itself without rhetoric. This was life arranged to minimize collision. To step across such a place felt like stepping across the inside of an answer. It implied that abundance could be held still, that labor could be replaced without loss, that solitude could protect. It also implied in quieter ways a narrowing. The estate allowed only what its master desired. Everything else was absent. The land did not protest, it simply forgot. Even the scents obeyed the program. Morning carried lemon, evening a faint dryness from the fields, and in the hours between, a polished sterility wandered the hallways on almost no air. touch when it mattered meant smooth composites and sealed wood. Textures that suggested where had been planned to suggest where, they recorded nothing. In this preserved atmosphere, memory had few anchors other than records, which the robots kept accurately. The land remembered everything for the human, so the human could remember nothing that burdened. Across Solaria, millions of such micro-decisions accumulated. Each estate reflected its owner's taste, yet every one functioned the same. Together, they formed a city without streets, only distances and invisible borders. There were no crowds to swell or disperse at gates. There were only single figures, occasionally stepping into sunlight, then returning to interiors designed for one. Figures whose signals carried farther through viewing than their bodies ever did. In that gentle geometry, Chapter 1 comes to rest. A terrain of solitude, perfected and preserved, carrying within it the calm certainty that the next day would unfold as this one had. The western hemisphere of Solaria stretched wide with orderly green grids, each hectare a carefully maintained farm estate. From orbit, the site resembled an enormous quilt of emerald squares, bordered by irrigation canals and glistening solar collectors. Each estate belonged to a single Solarian family, vast in size but almost entirely uninhabited by humans. Instead, tens of thousands of robots tended the fields, regulated the climate within protective domes, and harvested crops that would never be exported. The planet was nearly self-sufficient, producing more food than its small human population could consume. Yet excess did not matter. What mattered was control, order, and the maintenance of a solitary life where no neighbor could be seen except through a view screen. The farms were silent except for the low hum of machines. Air was filtered, pressure maintained, humidity balanced precisely to nourish imported vegetation. Grapevines, wheat, and orchards stretched outward in mathematical order, their symmetry a reflection of the Solarian obsession with precision. Every stalk of grain was measured by sensors, every leaf cataloged by automated drones. Unlike the crowded agricultural settlements of Earth, where thousands of hands labored and voices filled the fields, Solaria's land was cultivated almost entirely without human presence. The fields fed not communities, but individuals who lived far from each other in isolated mansions surrounded by seas of automated abundance. In the 3rd century of Solaria's development, a woman named Karela watched her estate through the crystal panes of her observatory. It was morning, though the artificial light had been programmed to mimic the slant of a late afternoon sun. Karela rarely stepped outside. Her skin reacted poorly to the natural air. Instead, she allowed her robots to bring her samples of soil, leaves, and fruit. On this particular day, a nutrient imbalance had been detected in one of the grape orchards. She instructed her robots to adjust the balance, but the process required several days. When the grapes returned to their expected state, Karela wrote in her records that Solaria's perfection depended not on the sun above, but on the silent compliance of machines. She believed it always would. The agricultural complexes of Solaria were more than mere food suppliers. They were symbols of the planet's philosophy. Each estate was designed to provide not only sustenance but also psychological comfort. Vast distances ensured privacy. Robots ensured safety and efficiency. The Solarians prided themselves on needing no one but their robotic servants. Even in the act of eating, They had distanced themselves from the communal origins of agriculture. Meals were often prepared, delivered, and consumed without another human presence. The farms were also laboratories. Crops were genetically modified to grow more efficiently under Solaria's pale sunlight. Livestock existed only in limited experimental enclosures, their care entrusted entirely to robots. The majority of Solarians preferred synthetic substitutes for meat and dairy, avoiding the noise and unpredictability of living herds. Silence and predictability defined the land as much as its physical boundaries. On the eastern slopes of a Solarian valley, a young technician named Jorindel once recorded a deviation in a wheat plantation. He was not there in person. He almost never was. Instead, he observed the anomaly from the safety of his residence through remote instruments. A sudden fungal growth had appeared despite automated safeguards. His robots engaged in decontamination, sealing off the field in transparent domes. Jorindel monitored the process, watching the slow eradication of each infected stalk. When the field was cleansed, he noted the incident in his log, marking it as an expected part of agricultural cycles. Yet he also reflected, with quiet unease, that without machines, such a simple outbreak would have devastated the land. His conclusion was factual. Solaria's safety rested entirely upon layers of machinery, not upon human resilience. The agricultural complexes revealed both the strength and the fragility of Solaria. On the surface, they were triumphs of efficiency, producing food for a population too small to consume it. Beneath, they were reminders of isolation, where even the simplest acts of farming, the tilling of soil, the gathering of harvest, had been surrendered to machines. Solaria's people had withdrawn from the physical experience of the land. They knew it only through glass walls, controlled climates, and mediated observation. What had begun as a solution to scarcity became, over generations, an emblem of distance from labor, from each other, and from the earth that had once demanded toil from every hand. The estates of Solaria were not simply houses. They were entire worlds arranged for one human life, with hundreds of rooms, galleries, laboratories, and gardens, all managed by 10,000 robots. Each mansion stood as the focal point of its surrounding agricultural domains, rising from orchards and plains, like an island of glass, alloy, and silence. To step inside one was to enter a universe whose gravity was defined by a single figure. The architecture followed principles of symmetry and distance. Halls stretched wide, but not to accommodate crowds, rather to emphasize space. Rooms were tall and airy, fitted with transparent ceilings that filtered light through selective spectrums. Interior gardens provided air balance and visual calm, maintained by caretakers who adjusted leaf moisture and soil acidity without ever disturbing the occupant. Sound was reduced to a hush, interrupted only by the measured movements of machines. The air itself was calibrated, its composition monitored to fractions of a percent, its temperature altered in quiet cycles to preserve physical comfort over centuries of residence. Though built with precision, the mansions remained personal archives of taste. A Solarian might request murals of abstract color, sculptures placed at measured intervals, or furniture tuned to a specific weight and resilience. Once decided, these choices often endured across generations. Robots preserved them with unbroken fidelity. A chair sat where it had been ordered decades earlier, polished daily, ready for a body that rarely touched it. These dwellings recorded not change but continuity, reflecting the planet's preference for permanence over novelty. In one such mansion on the northern continent, a man named Elron spent an entire morning in his music chamber. Robots maintained the acoustics of the domed hall, adjusting for air density and resonance. Elron rarely played for himself, preferring to command robots to perform compositions stored in planetary archives. On this day, he attempted to strike a chord on a synthetic string instrument. His hands, untrained and uncalloused, produced uneven notes. He stopped, gestured, and the robots continued the piece flawlessly. Elron listened quietly, aware that his own attempt was inferior, yet satisfied that perfection had been restored. He closed his eyes, not in pride, but in relief, as the machines carried the music to its calm conclusion. Each estate included chambers for projection, viewing rooms, where Solarians interacted with others without presence. These chambers were polished, antiseptic, and precise, fitted with projectors that replicated the image of another from afar. Meetings, friendships, and even marriages occurred through these projections. To step physically into another space was considered invasive, even unthinkable. Children learned this early, their schooling carried out through images and voices transmitted across distance. The mansion thus became not only a residence, but also a fortress of solitude, where social life unfolded as reflection rather than touch. Robots ensured this solitude remained inviolate. Thousands of units circulated unseen through service corridors, repairing systems, carrying supplies, and adjusting the mansion's microclimate. Some robots specialized in health monitoring, scanning the occupants' vital signs as they slept, adjusting nutrient intake, or preparing medical interventions in silence. Others maintained laboratories for genetic research, agricultural planning, or robotic design. Entire wings of mansions remained unused, preserved nonetheless, waiting for the possibility of an heir or visitor who rarely arrived. The scale of these estates often produced a paradox. Spaces were vast, yet nearly empty. Dining halls stretched for dozens of meters but seated only one. Galleries displayed collections admired only by their owner. Swimming pools shimmered beneath glass roofs, their surfaces unbroken for years at a time. Every part of the mansion demonstrated abundance, yet every room reinforced the solitude of its master. South of the equatorial forests, a woman named Drayle entered her botanical dome once each week. She preferred the scent of orchids, though she did not tend them herself. Robots measured humidity, adjusted nutrients, and rotated light panels to sustain the delicate blooms. On one visit, she noticed a single flower wilting earlier than expected. A caretaker robot explained the anomaly, its calm voice reciting chemical imbalances that had already been corrected. Drayle stood for a moment before the wilted bloom, observing its decline. She did not touch it. When she left, the flower was removed, the soil restored, and the dome reset to perfection. In her record, she marked the observation as minor, but she later recalled it as the only imperfection she had ever witnessed within her mansion. These solitary palaces were not only homes, but also instruments of social engineering. By reinforcing distance, they ensured that Solarians avoided presence even within their most intimate spaces. Husbands and wives met through viewing, conducted their lives apart, and often lived in different wings of vast estates. children were raised by robots, introduced to their parents through screens, and accustomed from infancy to solitude. Human intimacy, already strained, dwindled into rarity. The mansion thus became both cradle and cage, nurturing individuals into independence. So extreme, it erased the bonds that once defined community. From a wider perspective, the mansions illustrated Solaria's triumph in its fragility. They embodied luxury without labor, beauty without effort, safety without contact. Yet they also revealed a society in which the physical presence of another human had become unbearable. The very architecture of these estates discouraged gathering, discouraged touch, and encouraged the belief that solitude was the highest form of civilization. In later centuries, observers would remark that these mansions, though filled with wonders of automation, carried the atmosphere of absence. They were museums of lives lived apart, maintained with flawless care, yet lacking the ordinary wear of human presence. Staircases never echoed with multiple footsteps. Tables bore no marks of shared meals, and walls carried no residue of collective history. Instead, the mansions preserved individuals like artifacts, unchanged, solitary, and eventually destined to vanish, leaving only robots to continue their preservation. On Solaria, governance had no parliament, no crowding of officials, no chambers filled with voices. Instead, authority condensed into the judicial complex, a solitary cluster of structures at the planet's formal capital. To call it a city was misleading. The complex stood alone, a node of administration surrounded by hundreds of square kilometers of empty land, as though even the machinery of law required solitude. The buildings were low and angular, constructed from pale stone composites that reflected Solaria's steady sunlight. Walkways stretched outward in straight lines, their surfaces polished by cleaning units that passed hourly. Few humans set foot upon them. The complex existed as a nexus of transmission, where laws were written, cases adjudicated, and licenses issued, all across viewing channels. Rarely did its chambers host more than one physical occupant at a time. Within, halls were vast and immaculate, designed less for gatherings than for echo. Ceilings soared, but galleries sat empty, their benches tended by caretaker robots. Central chambers contained projectors, where litigants or administrators appeared as three-dimensional images rather than as bodies. In this way, disputes could be resolved without proximity, preserving the Solarian principle that presence equaled intrusion. The judicial complex embodied the paradox of Solaria, a society of absolute regulation paired with absolute distance. Birth was licensed, reproduction monitored by genetic councils, land managed through estate records that spanned centuries. Yet all of this occurred without face-to-face debate. Files passed through robotic intermediaries, decisions delivered across distance. Law no longer meant debate. It became only confirmation. On one occasion, a man named Telver submitted a petition for inheritance rights. His father had died, leaving an estate rich in orchard and machinery. Telver appeared in the projection chamber, standing in his own mansion miles away. His holographic image flickered before a solitary judge who sat in the great hall, accompanied only by robots. The ruling was delivered after minutes of review. The inheritance passed intact, as the law prescribed. Telver bowed formally to the image of the judge, though they had never occupied the same heir. Later, he recorded that the process had been efficient, free of discomfort, and entirely expected. His estate remained unchanged, and his solitude undisturbed. The complex did not merely arbitrate inheritance, it approved unions, ensuring genetic balance across the tiny Solarian population. Parents rarely met in person. Their pairing had more to do with charts than affection. When permissions were granted, announcements arrived as calm text across a projection wall. Even matters of dispute between neighbors, rare as neighbors were, passed through these chambers, reduced to data points rather than negotiations. Archives extended deep beneath the main hall, storing generations of records. Robots tended these archives as they did the fields and mansions, cataloging each decision, each reproduction license, each amendment to estate boundaries. These documents spoke not of vibrant civic life, but of maintenance, the quiet upkeep of a society designed never to exceed 20,000 souls. In the southern wing of the complex, a technician named Anvel once checked the calibration of the main projection grid. It was late evening, and the halls were empty. Robots tested light angles, adjusted sound diffusion, and polished the chamber's pale stone. Anvel stood in silence, observing the clarity of an image that represented a petitioner miles away. A minor distortion flickered along the shoulders of the projection. He corrected it, noted the adjustment, and filed the report. Years later, he remembered the task not for its difficulty, but for the profound stillness of the hall around him, where law was executed with almost no human presence at all. The judicial complex also managed Solaria's broader institutions. Scientific councils, trade reviews, and environmental commissions all fell under its remit, though they were less active than on other spacer worlds. Solaria had little external trade, and its science focused narrowly on genetics and robotics. These fields required data, not dialogue. Thus, the complex operated less as a forum and more as a conduit, where orders traveled one way and confirmations returned. The emptiness of the complex became its most striking feature. Visitors from other spacer worlds, rare and often unsettled, remarked upon its silence. Where they expected bustle, they found absence. Where they anticipated negotiation, they observed transmission. For Solarians, however, this was the ideal. A government that never gathered, never pressed people into contact, was considered a triumph of civilization. The architecture itself reinforced this principle. Corridors curved to avoid unexpected encounters. Doors recognized authorized individuals and resisted others with impersonal firmness. Rooms carried the scent of sterilized air, faintly metallic, scrubbed hourly by filtration units. Surfaces shone without fingerprints. One could walk the entire complex and never meet another human. And that experience would be counted not as emptiness, but as comfort. The judicial complex revealed the extent to which Solaria had perfected the art of governing without community. Law was abstract, people were abstract, and society became an equation maintained across distance. What was lost in the process, the negotiation of voices, the shared burden of compromise, was not mourned. For Solarians, absence was not a flaw but a feature, proof that their world had transcended the chaos of Earth's crowded cities. Yet the complex also hinted at fragility. With each ruling delivered through machines, with each record preserved without conversation, human participation dwindled. Law endured, but society thinned. What remained was an intricate system that could outlast its people, maintained by robots long after the chambers fell silent. Later centuries would prove this true. When Solaria emptied, the judicial complex remained intact, its machines still cataloging, still transmitting, still awaiting commands that would never arrive. At the heart of Solaria's intellectual life stood the research dome, a sprawling complex of laboratories sealed beneath layers of glass and alloy. Like the judicial complex, it was solitary, surrounded by kilometers of controlled land. Yet where law dealt with continuity, the dome dealt with refinement. Its purpose was not discovery, in the adventurous sense, but perfection. The endless improvement of what already existed. The dome gleamed in the daylight, its curved surface reflecting skies that had been shaped by orbital mirrors. Inside, chambers stretched outward in concentric circles. Genetics in the innermost halls, robotics in the surrounding wings, and atmospheric sciences along the perimeter. This arrangement symbolized Solaria's priorities. First the body, then the machine, then the environment that sustained both. Each chamber was a cathedral of solitude, built not for teams, but for individuals who interacted through projection. The focus on genetics reflected Solaria's demographic fragility. With a population capped at 20,000, every birth mattered. Councils within the dome tracked ancestry, monitored mutations, and arranged unions designed to preserve health. Records stretch back to the colony's founding, creating charts of descent more detailed than any spacer world. Here, reproduction was not intimacy but design. Robots processed tissue samples, ran simulations, and presented options, leaving the human geneticist to approve rather than create. Children were licensed like crops, their genomes edited for endurance, their destinies marked before birth. In the year 3550 CE, a geneticist named Relia sat alone in a circular laboratory surrounded by rows of humming analysis banks. A request had arrived. A couple sought permission for a child. Their ancestry carried a recessive flaw that, unchecked, might compromise the balance of Solaria's small gene pool. Relia examined the charts, reviewed the simulations prepared by her robots, and hesitated. The correction required a minor alteration, one that the machines recommended as statistically safe. She approved it with a single gesture. Later, she recorded the moment not as decision but as confirmation, noting that the robots had resolved the matter before she truly engaged. The child would be born flawless, and she would remember the day as one in which she had only nodded. The dome's robotics division represented Solaria's second obsession. With 10,000 machines per human, constant refinement was required. Engineers, rarely present in person, monitored design adjustments focusing on efficiency, coordination, and error prevention. Solaria did not innovate as Aurora had, but it perfected. Smoothing commands, reducing conflict between directives, and embedding privacy protocols so that robots could serve without violating the Solarian aversion to presence. The dome's archives included thousands of case studies where robots had faltered when obedience to human orders clashed with their laws. These records guided endless adjustments, layer upon layer of refinement, building a society in which robots operated as seamless extensions of solitude. One record tells of a caretaker unit in the agricultural districts that froze when ordered to enter a room without warning its master. Privacy and service collided, paralyzing the machine. In the dome, technicians replicated the scenario, testing variations until they designed a subroutine that delayed entry while signaling intention. The incident became a minor case in robotic law, studied for years, then forgotten, though the machines never forgot. They adjusted, corrected, and refined, ensuring that solitude and service would coexist without fracture. The outer chambers of the dome addressed climate and environment. Here, models of Solaria's atmosphere ran continuously, calculating rainfall schedules, cloud dispersal, and soil renewal. Solaria's weather lattice was not a static creation, but a living system of constant adjustment. Researchers monitored patterns, updated orbital algorithms, and ensured that the land remained as steady as its people required. These scientists, too, worked largely through robots who carried out experiments, sampled soil, and recalibrated climate drones. Human oversight became supervisory, a faint echo of engagement in a symphony performed by machines. The philosophy that guided the dome was not curiosity but control. Solarians sought no new frontiers, no expansion beyond their estates. Instead, they polished what they had chosen until variation disappeared. Genetics eliminated risk in bodies, robotics eliminated labor in lives, and atmospheric science eliminated chance in weather. Perfection became a horizon that always receded yet always promised to be within reach. The architecture of the dome mirrored this. Corridors curved in long arcs, their walls translucent, filled with shifting lights from data streams. Labs glowed with pale illumination, surfaces seamless, air silent, but for the faint hum of processors. Robots moved ceaselessly, their actions choreographed to avoid collision, their presence constant yet almost invisible. A human could walk the dome and see thousands of machines in motion while encountering no other person. In one chamber, a scientist named Dalvin once pursued an experiment on crop resilience. He directed his robots to alter the nutrient profile of a test orchard, predicting increased resistance to drought. Days later, projections confirmed his expectation. Robots harvested the modified grain, analyzed its properties, and adjusted soil parameters accordingly. Dalvin recorded his findings in a quiet log, then closed the session. Years afterward, no one remembered his name, but the adjustment remained in planetary protocols. The robots continued to apply it long after Dalvin's mansion stood empty. Through such refinements, the dome created the illusion of permanence, yet beneath this illusion lay dependency. Solaria's society required constant intervention, constant adjustment, constant monitoring. Without its dome, the planet would falter within years. Crops would decline, robots would drift into conflict, and the climate would resume its natural irregularity. The dome was both fortress and foundation, keeping solitude intact through endless service. To an outsider, the dome might have appeared cold, devoid of discovery, but to Solarians, it was proof that their civilization had achieved mastery over all variables. In a galaxy where Earth still wrestled with crowding and Aurora argued over leadership, Solaria stood alone, certain that its perfection required no further contact. Yet history shows that such perfection was brittle. The very reliance on genetics, robotics, and climate control created a society unable to adapt when patterns broke. The dome carried the seeds of Solaria's later collapse, a civilization perfected into stillness, unable to change without shattering. By the late Spacer centuries, Solaria appeared flawless on its surface. The estates gleamed, the weather unfolded with precision. The mansion stood immaculate, and the research dome refined life into ordered permanence. Yet beneath this polished calm lay tremors, subtle, almost invisible shifts that foreshadowed the planet's eventual abandonment. The first cracks appeared in population trends. Solaria's deliberate cap of 20,000 adults had long ensured stability, but the balance became precarious. Each death required replacement, each birth licensed only after lengthy genetic review. Marriages dwindled as aversion to presence deepened. And children, raised almost entirely by robots, grew accustomed to solitude, so complete that even projection felt burdensome. A society that prized distance had reached the point where its people no longer wished to replace themselves. Decline was slow, but it began with a simple fact. Fewer applications for children, fewer approvals, fewer heirs to inherit the estates. At the same time, the robotic system revealed strains. 10,000 machines per human required endless oversight, calibration, and refinement. Minor contradictions multiplied, especially where privacy laws conflicted with service, though the research dome labored constantly to smooth protocols. The burden of maintaining harmony increased. Robots resolved most conflicts without notice, but occasional failures unsettled their masters. Each failure was small: a delay in service, an unexpected pause, a command misunderstood. Yet in a society that demanded perfection, even the smallest deviation eroded confidence. In the western orchards of a minor estate, a caretaker robot once hesitated when ordered to cross a threshold. The owner, a man named Valen, had instructed it to enter immediately. The robot paused, calculating privacy protocols against the order. Valen grew agitated, repeating his command until the robot complied. The incident ended without consequence, but Valen noted the hesitation in his journal. He described it as a moment when his absolute mastery of service wavered, and he admitted to a brief sense of unease. He never mentioned the event again, but his entry survives as one of the first recorded acknowledgments of robotic strain. Beyond the estates, the judicial complex began to experience similar difficulties. Reproduction licenses were delayed as genetic charts grew more complex. Petitions lingered in archives as councils hesitated to act. The process that had once seemed efficient slowed, not from corruption, but from the weight of accumulated perfection. Each decision required layers of confirmation, and the more fragile the population became, the more each choice felt irreversible. What had been designed as a flawless system of governance turned into a labyrinth of caution. Socially, projection itself weakened. Where once Solarians had conducted friendships, debates, and even marriages through their viewing chambers, later generations withdrew further. Many chose to avoid even holographic contact, preferring to issue commands solely to robots. The culture of solitude hardened into near-total isolation. Estates that had once echoed faintly with transmitted voices fell quiet. A planet already devoid of gatherings now became a planet devoid of conversation. In the year 3650 CE, a woman named Lisara discontinued her regular projection sessions with her colleagues at the research dome. For decades, she had participated in weekly discussions on genetic model, and each appearing as a luminous image in the central chamber. One day, she simply ceased attending. Her colleagues continued without her, using her archived research to fill the gap. Lisara herself remained alive, active within her estate, but never again appeared in a projection. She issued instructions only through robots. When she died, her absence had already been normalized, as though she had departed centuries earlier. Externally, Solaria grew more distant from the other spacer worlds. Aurora had once prided itself as the leader of the spacers, but Solaria's withdrawal left little to lead. Trade dwindled to nothing, diplomacy faded, and Solaria became a closed system. To outsiders, the planet appeared self-sufficient, uninterested in the galaxy. But within that isolation carried the seeds of extinction. Psychologically, Solarians began to exhibit extreme aversion to presence. What had once been cultural preference hardened into phobia. Encounters like Elijah Bailey's investigation revealed this fragility. Solarians recoiled from him not only because he was an Earthman, but because he embodied presence itself, the intrusion of another's body into their air. By then, presence was considered contamination, intimacy, and illness. A people who lived by distance could no longer bear contact at all. These foreshadows converged in the centuries that followed. The estates remained beautiful, the robots efficient, the weather lattice precise. Yet behind this apparent triumph, the human element receded. Births declined, interactions diminished, and decisions slowed. The planet functioned perfectly, but fewer and fewer people lived within its perfection. Historians would later describe Solaria's decline not as collapse, but as evaporation. Nothing broke. No war, no disaster, no rebellion. Instead, society thinned until it disappeared, leaving only the infrastructure behind. When travelers and robots in Empire reached Solaria, they found a planet abandoned by its masters, its robots still active, maintaining mansions and orchards for absent owners. The judicial complex still processed files no one submitted. The research dome still refined protocols for a population that no longer existed. Solaria had not fallen. It had simply dissolved. This outcome had been foreshadowed for centuries. Each hesitation, each withdrawal, each silence was a step toward absence. In seeking solitude, the Solarians had perfected it so completely that they eventually achieved solitude, not only from each other, but from existence itself. The end of Solaria was unlike the end of other worlds. No fire consumed it, no armies besieged it, no famine stripped its fields. Instead, the planet remained immaculate as its people faded away. Orchards bore fruit to be gathered by robots that waited for orders never given. Mansions gleamed with polished walls, their halls silent, their chambers preserved. The judicial complex continued to process protocols, and the research dome refined systems for generations that would never arrive. What remained was a civilization's ghost, machines carrying on their service without masters, perfection extending into emptiness. Later historians studied Solaria not as a tale of conquest or failure, but as a caution. It had demonstrated how abundance could erode community, how solitude raised to doctrine could end in extinction. Yet its legacy also lived on in robotics and genetic sciences. Fields advanced to their sharpest edges within those domes of glass. Even in its disappearance, Solaria had contributed to the galaxy's knowledge. Its perfection was not lost, only scattered, carried into the larger story of humankind's reach. In the stillness of Solaria, one finds a mirror for civilization's choices. Here was a world that sought freedom from labor and chaos. It turned distance into law and solitude into culture. For centuries it thrived, untouched by war, untroubled by hunger. Yet the very qualities that preserved it also undid it. By removing presence, Solaria removed community. By removing labor, it removed resilience. And by seeking permanence, it denied change. To walk its abandoned orchards in imagination is to hear the faint hum of machines carrying on without purpose, maintaining a perfection no longer required. The silence that remains is not only planetary, but philosophical. A reminder that civilization is not measured by its mastery of environment, but by the ties that bind its people together. Solaria mastered the world it lived on, but lost the world within itself. Its story closes, not in catastrophe, but in absence, the quietest end that history has recorded.